one of my roles is as the chair of the Connecticut Institute for the 21st Century. And what this entity is it's a group of public and private center individuals who got together starting in, I guess it was starting in 1997. I've only been involved since for the last 5 or 6 years. But the objective was to look at what can we do to make Connecticut more competitive. And the things that, when I took over as chair about 6 years ago, decided to focus on some of Connecticut's fiscal issues. When we looked at the time, there was huge budget deficits the state was going to be facing. So we picked out some items that to do some analysis of, and we hired Bloom Shapiro, and they did a number of studies on big ticket items in the state budget. So some of the things we tackled were the long-term care system and how that can be affected and how we can make some changes there. Then corrections, parole, and probation systems, which is another big issue. Then pension and other post-employment benefits, how we can improve the delivery of public services, mainly through the use of non-for-profits, and then a survival plan for some of our splintered service delivery systems. And the one we're tackling now is on the strategic use of technology. That's a study we're going to use right now. And these are all for the state to provide information to the policymakers within the state to see if there are ways we can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the delivery of the services that are needed and demanded within the state. So that is the role of the Connecticut Institute for the 21st Century. And the study that I wanted to chat about a little bit was one we did at the end of 2010 on parole, the parole, probation, and the correction system. And when we looked at it, the study showed that the costs, and this is nationally, that are really tied directly to the size of the incarcerated population. Probably no big surprise because it's the guards and the people that have there that really drive most of the cost. But an increase in the prison population have really been shown to be driven by policy and not necessarily by crimes per se. Treatment, reentry plans, rehabilitation, community programs, these are all less expensive and more effective than incarceration is what the study had indicated. Now in Connecticut, I think the Department of Corrections budget for fiscal year 2014 is like $670 million, and the appropriation for fiscal year 15 is about $689 million. The direct staffing costs relate to about 58% of the department's total budget. And based on current union contracts, the only way to effectively control the cost is to reduce the number of inmates. And this can then permit the closing of facilities or partial closing of facilities of the correction personnel and then to move them to other facilities and cut down on the overtime that they all work. In 2010, to put this in perspective, the average expenditure per inmate was $92.35 per day. Now that's 9 times the average daily expenditure for someone on probation, which is about $10. And clearly policies that reduce the prison population through parole, probation, community-based transitional services will save money for the state. Now, you have to do this very conscientiously. But our study found that even before 2010, Connecticut had actually been fairly successful in reducing the prison population. In fact, the Department of Corrections closed one facility in 2009, and the decline was really due to a number of factors, including increasing the number of offenders that were released to the community supervision, and then the efficiency of pre-trial evaluation programs. Now, our study also found that the prison population would continue to trend downward, but if existing policies were maintained, but probably at a much slower rate. And Connecticut actually has adopted some of the best thinking and national trends to improve the system. So they've done a pretty good job. But the state really needs to continue to accelerate and systematically institutionalize the changes that they did put in place that they began with. So some of the things we recommended were to establish a comprehensive information system across the entire criminal justice system. If you can envision this, probation doesn't talk to parole or corrections. They're separate systems. One's in the Department of Justice, one's in corrections. So, and actually one of the things we're looking at with the next study is on the strategic use of technology within the state. Hopefully we can bring things together so that the different departments and divisions within the state can now communicate with each other and see what's going on in different parts of the state, and then actually get some information. Getting information, as many of you know, is very challenging within the state. We also want to continue to decrease the incarcerated population, and there's some ways that that can be done. Many of the people that are in prison were in there for drug use or some very minor reasons where there's mandatory sentencing requirements. And some of these people are not, really a threat to society, and they're better off being back in the communities. So that's one thing we think that can be done. We also got to engage the Connecticut business community in the process of reform and reentry. I heard a few questions earlier about jobs. That's another big issue. How do you get jobs for people that have been incarcerated and then come out, done their time, and now they're ready to reintegrate into society? So it's up to the business community to be open, to be hiring people like that. And that, as I think many of you are aware, has been a challenge. So it's really encouraging the business community to look creatively at how we can then provide jobs, and jobs that we need. I mean, many businesses are hiring people. Right now, this recession has kind of put a crimp on how many people are getting hired. I think most of us are aware of that. The last speaker said we've lost 80,000 manufacturing jobs, and that's a big void that needs to be filled somehow. But I think the business community needs to step up more. Some of the other things we recommend is renegotiating the union contracts to be more cost effective, and this goes across the state. Now, we also know that a few years ago the governor did renegotiate the contracts somewhat, and now they're frozen for a period of time. So the possibility of renegotiating today is probably fairly low. We need to standardize some of our risk instruments, and this just means, some of the things we look at, have standards for them rather than doing things a little more ad hoc. One of the big things that I came across, and this was John Santa's, I had met with him a couple of years ago, on a faith-based, character-based program for incarcerated males. And one of the things that I came away with was they had done this in, I believe, in Florida, and the recidivism rate had gone from something like 67% down to 6% when they grouped people who wanted to really change their lives, had a character-based, faith-based approach to the prison system, and put them into an area where they agreed that they were going to change their lives, and they did, and then they didn't go back to prison. And I think most of you are aware that recidivism is one of the big issues we have with the prison population, and people too often end up back in prison because there are no jobs, there are no other things that they can count on in their community. Another one, use meritorious good time off for certain offenders where we can get them reincorporated into the communities. Provide sufficient funding for reentry programs and measure the results and the cost effectiveness. And this is something business does all the time. We look at what are the results, how effective we were. I think the state needs to start looking at this. How do you measure what you've done, and is it being effective? Extending early release and furlough programs, and then continuing to build and enhance partnerships with community-based service providers. There's a lot of opportunities there for us to work jointly. Now, what's been the progress since 2010? The governor created an undersecretary position at OPM for the Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division. It's one of the things we had suggested. The Connecticut Sentencing Commission was established, and it now includes 2 representatives from the business community. The Risk Reduction Earned Credit Program has also been implemented, and a statewide evidence-based risk and needs assessment is now in place. The structured parole decision-making framework is in use, and there is a website to provide information on services available for the population. And there are more discretionary release programs available than there were before. So we have been moving in the right direction, but more still remains to be done. The Department of Corrections has applied for a federal grant to train inmates to become skilled manufacturing workers. Now, we need the manufacturing jobs, but getting the training program and providing them training not just for manufacturing, but for what jobs are available in our state. We need to look at what jobs are there and then make sure people are getting trained to fulfill those jobs. The department, the judicial branch, educators, nonprofit organizations, and the business community really has to work together to provide successful work opportunities for the reentry population. There are ways we can do this, and we need to get the business community more involved so that they can see the opportunities that could be created. Another, we have pipelines. There's the New Haven pipeline. There's other entry level jobs that these people are aware of that can help facilitate putting people back to work. The union contracts, they provide very little flexibility to allow for cost reduction in the criminal justice system. One of the things the Institute's been looking at is how do we get the cost down in the state to make the state more competitive? That's one of the things we've been focused on. One of the reasons we looked at the criminal system, the justice system, was because it is a very large number in the state budget. So if we can get it more effective, deliver the services more effectively, which means reducing the prison population, I think we can help with this in the state as well. The faith-based programs in other states result in much lower recidivism rates, and we really need to implement those in Connecticut, find ways to get that done. And successful reentry programs need to be adequately funded and sustained. So those are some of the recommendations that we came up with in the study that Bloom-Shapiro worked on. And with that, I'm going to take the opportunity, thank you for allowing me to share the work that the Institute has done. And I hope this conference is very successful, and I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Our second speaker today has been working closely with the IMRP to bring about the Pew-McGregor Results First initiative to Connecticut. Sara Dube is the manager of the Pew-McArthur Results First initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust. She helps advance the use of cost-benefit analysis and cultivate a climate for evidence-based decision-making that can enable states to eliminate ineffective programs and shift resources to those that generate the best outcomes. Sara works with state partners, including those in Connecticut, to implement proven analytical tools that more accurately assess the true costs and benefits of programs, of public programs. She also helps policymakers use the findings to drive state dollars towards programs with the highest returns on taxpayer investments. Sara holds a master's degree in public policy from the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in history and child development from Tufts University. Today, Sara will share more information about the Pew-McArthur Results First initiative as we look to incorporate this new fiscal management tool within our state. It is my pleasure to welcome Sara Dube. Sara?
Thanks very much for that kind introduction and for having me at this wonderful event today. I think one of the themes of the day that I've heard so far is that Connecticut really has been a pioneer in a lot of this work, and you certainly have been for Results First as well. So I'm planning to just give a little bit of an overview of the project and touch on the good work that's been done here in Connecticut, and hopefully take some questions and start a dialogue with you all, because I really do think this is the beginning of yet another really exciting partnership between evidence-based policymaking initiatives and the state of Connecticut. So as the kind introduction mentioned, I'm Sara Dube. I'm the manager of the Pew-McArthur Results First initiative, which, as you may have guessed, is very creatively titled as a joint initiative of the Pew Charitable Trusts and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. We launched back in 2010 with this simple yet ambitious mission, which is to help policymakers identify and invest in what works. Now, I think we can all agree that policymakers want to make strategic choices, but in times of fiscal constraint, often have to rely on things like across-the-board cuts or incremental budgeting. And of course, there are many factors at play, but one of the things that we have seen in our work across the country is that there really is an information gap. Policymakers and many other stakeholders are missing some key information that's necessary to make those difficult decisions. As we heard this morning from Mike Thompson and from others, that we really have come a long way. There is so much more data and so much more evidence than we had even 10 years ago, but we've got a ways to go, and that's what Results First is here in Connecticut and across the country to help do, to fill that information gap and to use that information to help make some of the more difficult policy and budget decisions, certainly in the criminal justice arena, and in some other social policy areas as well. So that probably all sounds all well and good, but how does Results First do that? Well, Results First brings what we call an innovative approach to cost-benefit analysis. So instead of just calculating a single cost-benefit ratio for one program, this approach allows the user or policymakers or whomever is interested in this model to do an apples-to-apples comparison of a variety of programs across policy areas. So you're really able to look at the outcomes and the costs and benefits through a single lens, as opposed to having to look at multiple different studies and making sense of them. It's really allowing you to focus on program outcomes as a whole across various domains. So at the 30,000 foot level, this approach does three main things. First, it draws on an extensive national research base. Our partners at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, or WISIP, have spent the better part of 2 decades reviewing tens of thousands of program evaluations and assessing them against a very strict set of criteria. Now, using only the best of those studies, they determine what the program's impact would be using an approach called meta-analysis. So this results in a very clear prediction of what a program's impact or outcomes would be on a given population, the population that it's intended to serve. Now, where it gets interesting is in these next 2 steps. The model estimates the expected outcomes if that program that has evidence in the national research base were to be implemented here in Connecticut using state population data. And third, the model uses Connecticut's own fiscal data to calculate what those program outcomes or what those expected benefits will be worth over time, resulting in a state-specific return on investment estimate for each program that is offered here in Connecticut. So this approach is really bringing the best of both worlds to bear. You've got this robust national research base. We know that no one wants to reinvent the wheel, especially since all this great work has been done over the past 20 years. But it also brings very state-specific information to bear as well. And that, as we know, is really important because it's all well and good to know what a program looks like in a different state, but we need to know what it looks like here in Connecticut and what it's worth to the people of Connecticut. So once you're able to run that model for a bunch of different programs, you're able to generate what we in Washington State have been calling the consumer reports type list. Now this is just a sample, and keep in mind that this is Washington State information with Washington State 2013 dollars. This is not representative of Connecticut, but Connecticut has begun doing similar studies such as this. But what this is doing is ranking selection, as you can see here, of adult and juvenile justice programs based on their expected return on investment. So we start on the left-hand columns by developing a program inventory. We've been working here in Connecticut for about 2.5 years now with Andrew and his great team, many of whom are here today, to really figure out what are the programs that are offered here in Connecticut that are aimed at reducing recidivism, and what do they cost. This is information that is not readily available in most states, so you are not alone, but this has been a heavy lift, and the team here has done a fantastic job in collecting this information. This is a really important step in filling that information gap. What programs are offered here in the state? What are they costing the state? Before we even get to something like what sort of outcomes are they achieving. But those are the most exciting parts, what the outcomes they're achieving and what's worth to the state. So the third column there is the long-term benefits. What is this program achieving, and what is that outcome, in these cases the reduction in recidivism, worth to the state of Connecticut? And then of course the cost-benefit ratio. For every dollar invested in this program, for something like cognitive behavioral therapy, Washington State is gaining about $25. For something like their domestic violence treatment program, they're losing more than $4 for every dollar invested. So this is really what we call an investment tool. And instead of just being able to gather information, organize information, which it certainly does, that is important, and we want to make sure that information is collected and presented in a way that makes sense. But we also feel that this takes a step further. This really helps policymakers and other stakeholders make decisions based on this information. We know what's going to provide the best bang for the buck here in Connecticut, and we encourage policymakers to make decisions based on this evidence. As someone said earlier, we can acknowledge information and data all day long, but we need to make use of it in order for real policy and budget change to occur. So that's a big part of what we're doing here too, making decisions based on this important information. So Results First is working in 14 states and 2 California counties, representing a variety of geographic and political contexts. We're in red states, blue states, big states, little states, all across the country. And as you can see, Connecticut is in very good company here in the Northeast, which is very exciting to me because I grew up in Massachusetts. New York, Vermont, and Massachusetts all started around the same time as Connecticut, and Rhode Island came on board last spring. So you're in very good company, and as I'll mention in a minute, the work that's been done here in the Northeast is actually some of the most exciting that we've seen in results for states so far, which I'm not surprised. Only the best comes from the Northeast. So when I say that we're working in all these jurisdictions, I really mean that we're helping states and counties build their own capacity to do these types of analyses over time. Results First provides intensive technical assistance, both in terms of the very technical side of that, so training staff and how to collect and analyze the data needed to use the model, and also in terms of the technical assistance where it comes to kind of communications and outreach and working with policymakers and the end users of this information to figure out what sort of policy and budget deliberations this type of information can help assess. We also provide the tool itself, which is pretty much just Excel on steroids with a visual basic overlay, so it makes it a little more user-friendly, but all of that is provided free of charge, though I will say, and I'm sure Andrew will agree with me here, that there is a good amount of staff resources involved. So, but our goal is really to train staff here in Connecticut to be able to do this type of analysis over time and really continue to build that culture of evidence-based policymaking. So, when people say, this is great, you're working all over the country, I'm glad you're in my state, what have these states been up to? Have we actually seen any sort of success or any sort of action? Again, back to that theme that I've mentioned earlier of, that's great that you have all this evidence, but is anyone actually doing anything with it? Well, the answer that we've seen so far is yes. States have been doing some great things, and we measure success in a few ways. In 2013, 6 of our states, Connecticut, of course, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont implemented their own state-specific versions of this Results First model and presented results to stakeholders in a variety of settings. 3 more of those states, again with Connecticut in the lead here, enacted legislation incorporating Results First into their policymaking processes. As some of you may have heard, there is now a Connecticut Results First Policy Oversight Committee that was established in 2013 and had its first 2 meetings in the fall. It's co-chaired by Representative Walker and Undersecretary Lawler, and is really off to a great start in terms of really continuing to build this culture of evidence-based policymaking, not only for criminal justice, but also starting to look at some other areas as well, which are distinct but certainly linked to criminal justice, like child welfare and education, mental health, and substance abuse. The other 2 states, again with the Northeast in the lead here, are Massachusetts and Vermont. 2 states, Iowa and Illinois, use their models to analyze different proposed bills, avoiding millions of potential costs. So this is not necessarily something that we were expecting states to do with their models, but is a great example of how, again, Results First is really helping to build states' capacity. So if there's something that Connecticut wants to do with this approach, that is certainly possible, and we're here to help figure out how to do that here in the state. And then lastly, 5 states, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont, use their models to target nearly $38 million in funding through investing in highly effective programs. So that means either shifting resources from things that don't work, as generated by that table that I showed you, to things that do work, to things that are proven to be highly effective. So I've mentioned Iowa a few times, so I wanted to just dig into the Iowa story a little bit, because I think there's some interesting things there that you may want to keep in mind in Connecticut as we continue to move forward together. So since 2011, we've been working with the Iowa Department of Corrections to develop their own Results First model to address specifically adult criminal justice programs. They haven't started to look at juvenile programs or any of the other policy areas yet. They've been focusing on the adult system. So I'll give you 2 examples of some interesting things they've done both to cut and to build. So Iowa's Results First model demonstrated that the specific program they're using for domestic violence offenders, their Batteries Education Program, actually increases recidivism and loses the state $3 for every dollar invested in the program. Where's my new friend, Giselle? So I believe this is a program. This is the technical term for something that has poor outcomes and a very low return on investment for the state. It's not good. It's not one we want to invest in going forward. However, this is a type of service that needs to be offered for certain offenders. So the Department of Corrections went to the University of Iowa and developed an alternative program called Achieving Change Through Value-Based Behavior, or ACTIVE, which the state is currently piloting in a handful of judicial districts. And at one-year outcomes this past fall, this new pilot is producing positive results, and they hope to be able to expand it throughout the state, replacing this ineffective program. So this is a great example of using that information to make a change, to find that there's something that is not working, and to get creative about making it work in a way that is cost-effective and provides good outcomes for the state. On a positive note, Iowa's model demonstrated that the cognitive behavioral therapy programs, both in prison and in the community, are inexpensive and effective, which is really the sweet spot for this type of analysis. They found that for every dollar invested in the program, they're seeing between $25 and $35 in returns over time. Now, like many states last year, and probably for many years to come, there wasn't additional funding to be able to target to expand this program. So the Department of Corrections, again, got creative. They used their findings from the Results First model, applied for, and eventually received a technical assistance grant from the National Institute of Corrections to receive training on Thinking for a Change, or T4C, which, as many of you may know, is a highly effective cognitive behavioral therapy program. So through this training, they've increased the number of staff who are able to provide this service and provide the program with fidelity, and in doing so have increased their capacity for providing this important evidence-based program, all without using additional funds. So again, this is another way that the state of Iowa has gotten creative and used their results to actually invest in programs that work, invest in programs that not only are providing excellent services, generating very positive outcomes, but are also giving the best returns for the state of Iowa, which again is really the sweet spot with this work. And building on this success, Iowa is not only continuing to use the Results First model to look at adult criminal justice programs over time, because this really is a long-term initiative. We want them to be able, and the people of Connecticut to be able to look at this type of analysis over time, session after session, budget cycle after budget cycle. But Results First is also working in Iowa to expand their model to look at juvenile justice programs, child welfare programs, and education programs. And I know that that conversation is happening in Connecticut as well. There's an interest in thinking through all those linkages that clearly happen between the criminal justice arena and many other areas of social policy. So that's something that we'll be continuing to work with the state of Connecticut on to develop in the future. So that's really just a good story of another state, one of Connecticut's fellow Results First states that's found some really creative ways to use their model, and we encourage Connecticut to continue the good work that you've been doing. I just wanted to recognize really quickly, there's quite a few supporters and members of the Connecticut Results First team here. Bill Carbone, Brian Hill, Pat Hines. I saw Undersecretary Lawler back there. I believe Representative Walker is here or coming soon, and of course Andrew and his whole team. Over the past 2.5 years, they've really committed themselves and their talents to this important project, and I really think we're only at the beginning. Connecticut has done some fantastic work so far. I know there's an annual report from the Policy Oversight Committee that's going to be coming out in February, so there'll be a lot more information about what's been happening there, but we encourage the state to keep down this route. There are so many things that have been going right here, both with Results First, obviously with JRI, things like results-based accountability. I think this really is a state that has pioneered evidence-based policymaking, and we look forward to continuing to work with you to identify and invest in the programs that provide the best outcomes and the best returns for the people of Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Jim. And right now we can entertain some questions. If anybody has any on Results First, maybe some ideas on how to engage the business community. Anybody?
Sarah, in Iowa, the vocational educational programs that were instituted or invested in, could you tell us any of those specifically?
I don't believe I referred to vocational education. It was cognitive behavioral therapy. That was a Washington example. So that's from Washington State this past year. That's really just a, would you mind going back? This one? Okay. So I actually don't have a lot more information on that one right now, but I'm happy to follow up with you if you just send me an email. I'd be happy to send you more information on that one.
Hi, my question is for Jim. Hi, Jim. I think it's incredibly important that the business community is a part of the process and making sure that folks are able to, like, not only is the state able to reduce costs, but folks are able to be employed. So I guess I got a two-part question. In talking to your membership so far at the CBIA, what's been the reaction of folks, and if you've already had the talks, what's been the reaction to, we want to move into hiring ex-offenders? What's been the reaction from the membership? That's the first part. The second part is, what does the CBIA determine to be a sustainable wage? Because a lot of the folks that are, as we talked about earlier, a lot of the folks that are coming back into the community, they're like on their first legs, and they're just getting started. If you're just getting started, if it's a entry-level job, so to speak, as an adult, how do you manage, especially when, the CBIA for a while has kind of put their ideas out there on what they think a sustainable wage is. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, I've been the chair of CBA for about a month, so not very long. But from my own company's experience with United Illuminating and the gas companies, we have been actually hired ex-offenders, and we've hired them into some of our entry-level apprentice jobs like line workers. We've had some people that have gone through our line school. We have people who work in our call centers. And so if people will find and put in an application, and there are jobs available at times that people can look at. Now, from CBI, I haven't really talked to the membership about that yet. I mean, it's something that we probably will do, because this is an issue that's fairly important. But as far as living wage, I mean, you have to look at each company individually, and you can't say that one's going to apply to another, because every business has a different model, different cost structures, different revenues that they get. For our company, we have mainly a lot of the jobs that people start in are union jobs or management jobs. So, for us, it's people start out at a fairly reasonable level. I mean, even the call center people would make anywhere from $35,000 to $60,000 a year, depending on their level and which area they're in. Line workers, they progress through and do better. We have pipe fitters. We have people who work in field work, street crews, for the gas companies. So there are a lot of jobs there. And again, it's going to be different for every company and every business. So I can't give you a flat answer, say it's X, because it's going to be different by business. But looking at some of the things that need to be done, it's something that CBIA in training and education is something that CBIA has been very focused with, and I think that's going to continue. Thank you.
Torgerson?
Yes.
You mentioned about the reentry release programs, and you say as far as training people before they come home. Well, in DOC, I was incarcerated. They don't do that. But now I believe the state of Connecticut, if they come up with a plan to start inside, and because before they told us something about bonding. And like, I guess you get bonded when you come out to work. But I don't know anybody that's been bonded before. But the state of Connecticut, they can create jobs. Like far as they invest, like in a company, and they started through the DOC, and then they get released to go to the halfway house, and you guys come up with a company. I believe that should be something.
Yeah, I think the first part you said with having training before you exit
Yes.
would make a lot of sense, because it seems like we need to be advocating at the state, at the legislature, for the programs that would facilitate that, so that you get the training when you need it, before you're coming out, and then you can have something to back you up when you go to look for a job. To me, that makes sense. You're not going to, just like when we're hiring people, if you have to have a high school diploma, we're not going to hire them when they're a sophomore in high school.
Yes.
They have to graduate, or a degree. So it seems like you need the training and the, beforehand. And I think that's something that should be advocated at the state in the legislature. And I gotta believe the money should be found, because that would be a more effective way of dealing with things rather than having people go back to prison. That doesn't make any sense to me.
It'll be less
So
worries.
I agree with you.
It'll be less worries when you release them on the streets.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good way to do it. Thank you.
And we have time for one more question. I'd just like to say the Policy Oversight Committee and the chairs are in particular have been looking at vocational education because of what the model has shown for the cost benefit as a way that we can not only focus on that issue, but reach out to the business community and see how we can make it better. So.
Thank you. I have a question and comment as well. And I don't mean to sound as if I'm in defense of anything here, but the benefit of experiences I've had, Jim is absolutely right. It's going to be different in different places. So trying to devise a one plan that suits all is going to be extremely difficult to do. Case in point was this. Had a young man approach me. He'd been working at SNET, climbing those poles, getting awards, and all of a sudden something happened. His application said that he did not say he was a felon. He was out and gone. So I go to the boss and say, hey, look, can you give this guy a break? Just help him out. I mean, he's done all of this. He's demonstrated he want to do this, and bing, to bing, to bing. He said, okay, Bill, I'll take a look at it. 2 weeks later, he says, Bill, I went to talk to my people, and I'm having a problem because if I bring him in after he's told the tale on the application, I got problems with people inside. So if he got a problem with people inside, so now he has the issue of being concerned about those who are already there as opposed to bringing others in, and what kind of turmoil does that potentially create inside the place even before. So it becomes really, it's not the same in each place. Now, I want to say to Jim, the fact that he's here, and it's easy for us to kind of put this load on his shoulder, but what is it that you think that we can do here to make your efforts to deal with this issue effective and successful? What is it that you think that we can do? I heard you say something about, one, the training ought to take place inside, and I agree, but you talk to people in corrections, and that's a difficult one to do. So what can we do? I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. The thing, most of us in the business community really don't know what you're up against. I mean, let's face it, we're not in that position. So it'd be helpful to know what you need to be successful. What do you need? Is there training? Is there a mentorship? Is there something that you need that we can then figure out? Maybe there's a way we can help provide it. I don't have all the answers. I mean, I'll tell you that right now. But if you can tell me what you need and tell us, what would be helpful to you, and not just to get a job, but I mean, what training might you need? What other programs would be helpful? And that, to me, would be probably the most helpful. And then what you could do to be helpful is if there's something that we need to get done at the legislature. I know, Bill, you were there for quite a few years, well, a long time, very successfully. And but what do we need to do to work with the legislature or the governor to figure out what programs make sense? And this, you know, it's not just a matter of spending more money, it's spending the money we have effectively and efficiently to make sure the programs that we have are going to bring the results we really want, which is to get people jobs and so they're not going back to prison. I mean, that is, so tell us what would work, and then you advocating to the legislature and to the governor is going to be very important. Not just relying on somebody else to do it, but we also need to know what would be helpful. And, you know, you have John, who's done great work. And, you know, I think if you get to some of those organizations like his, CBIA can actually be very helpful in training and in providing education and working with the education community to provide those. So there are things that we need to know first, and then we can do what we can to help. And I think that'd be the most helpful thing to me. So thanks, Bill.
Thank you, and you acknowledged John, so I want to do it as well. The the Criminal Justice Initiative helped to sponsor this event, and I want to thank them for that. And also, you know, when we talked about putting this together, one of the things was, all right, this was a rather large event, but can we break things down and move the ball forward a little bit in the various component parts in the academic, in the faith, and in the business community? So we'd love to, you know, take an hour at an actual business event and be able to present or things like that. And so we'd love to explore ways to do that and actually reach the communities. I know, because we're a lot of times I've heard it, we're speaking to the choir, but I think that's valuable. But at the same time, I think it's valuable then to extend on and see what we can do to have dialogues for people that we need to just generally coalesce with to move the ball down the road on this issue. So I want to thank you both for participating and saying your words.